Thank you for joining us today, the day of the eclipse. Very exciting. My name is Karen Chappell. I'm director of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto and professor of geography and planning. The School of Cities, as you know, is a think and do tank that connects universities to communities around us to co-create solutions for the complex urban challenges we face. It's my pleasure to be hosting Tim Dixon and Mark Tewdwr-Jones today, here to discuss their book, Urban Futures, Planning for City Foresight and City Visions. Before I introduce our guests today, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The land on which the School of Cities operates is the ancestral and unceded territory of the many Indigenous peoples that call this land home, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. I recognize the ongoing role of colonialism and the consequences for Indigenous peoples, and the ways in which other systems of oppression intersect with colonialism to deny so many people a place to call home. I affirm our commitment and responsibility to advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, fostering closer relationships between nations, and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous ways of knowing. And finally, I acknowledge the many whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations, and we're grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and who have gone before us. Since we're meeting virtually today, I encourage each of today's attendees to consider the colonial histories of the land they call home. I'd like to remind our audience about a few Zoom housekeeping policies. Today's session will be recorded. We will ask you all to keep your mics on mute for the duration of the presentation. We encourage you to share your questions in the chat, however, throughout the presentation and discussion. They'll be collected by our staff and we'll have time to address them hopefully at the end of the session. We also have some great sessions you sent in advance, so thank you. Please practice good etiquette. If you demonstrate inappropriate language or behavior, we reserve the right to remove you. So again, I'm delighted to have this discussion about urban futures. As I was telling Professors Dixon and Tewdwr-Jones, I invited them because I really feel like we don't talk about vision enough in Canada, and we don't talk about the vision for our cities and regions and how we can come about it collectively. And I believe this is a discussion the School of Cities should get involved with, and all Canadians should want to make happen for the good of our country and as we face climate change, inequality, and other challenges. So I'm delighted to welcome our guests. Tim Dixon is Emeritus Professor at the University of Reading, a research associate at the Global Center for Healthcare and Urbanization, and a visiting fellow at Kellogg College. Tim is a qualified chartered surveyor and has more than 40 years of experience in built environment research, teaching, and practice. His research encompasses city foresight, future studies, sustainable futures in the built environment, and social sustainability. Mark Tewdwr-Jones is Bartlett Professor of Cities and Regions at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at University College London. With degrees in urban planning, political science, and film, Mark is one of the leading planners globally. His expertise covers urban and regional planning, spatial planning policy, planning engagement, digital planning, housing, and urban futures. He's worked in government, given evidence to legislative committees, has advised cities and research councils globally, as well as the World Bank, OECD, and others. So welcome, and over to you, Mark and Tim.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your very warm welcome. We're both delighted and honoured to be here today. We plan to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then obviously there'll be time for questions after that. We're very proud of the book, I think, that we wrote. It was a kind of almost like a lockdown project where we came together before lockdown first hit back in 2019, And so we wrote it during some very tough times for a lot of people, and reflecting back on that, personally speaking, it was one of the most, despite all the difficulties that many people face, it was one of the most enjoyable collaborative projects that I've been involved in, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with Mark. We actually share a little bit of a Welsh heritage, although Mark's DNA percentage is much higher than mine. Okay, the next slide. We have a problem with, I think. I might have to switch at this point to the PDF version. Okay. Is everybody seeing that PDF?
Yes?
Yeah.
Great. Apologies about the technical glitch there. So I suppose the really important question we wanted to pose right now at this moment is, why do we consider urban futures so important? I think I personally reflect on what's been happening in Oxford recently, where you may have seen quite a lot of controversy over the conspiracy theories that have been promoted around low traffic neighborhoods and 15-minute cities, which are very topical subjects, but some right-wing politicians and even government ministers have subscribed to the fact that these are designed to almost create another lockdown for people that prevents them moving even from their houses and homes. And of course, this creates an artificial culture war in many ways, which is designed to create political gain for certain reasons. We have to acknowledge that people often don't feel happy about some of the policies that are promoted, but if they're carried out in a democratic way and those democratically elected councillors have implemented the policies, then surely that's a proper outcome. But part of the problem is that the debate has become polarised. So as well as no Oxford LTNs, we also have people concerned about climate change and net zero, and how we kind of tackle this whole issue of global warming. So we have two very different points of view around how the future might work out. And we know that the facts certainly subscribe to the fact that we need to arrest global warming to keep it within 1.5 degree limit. So how do we kind of reconcile these very different views about the way a city needs to tackle its future? And one way in which we can do that is to think realistically and in a very participatory way about how we construct a proper city vision that encompasses the real democratically aligned vision for that place. And so the book that we wrote really tackles a number of key themes. First of all, it looks at how cities have developed in their complexity, how they kind of have developed over time. What exactly is a city? There are lots of different definitions around what a city comprises, from a geographical sense to a literary sense, to the sense of what the mental maps of people living in neighborhoods might be. For one person, the city may be very different from another. And of course, over the course of time, we've seen changing narratives of the city through literature, film, art, and academic discourse, which again we cover in the book. We pay particular attention to city foresight. We look at transitions theory, and we see how those are related to developing city visions for particular places. And of course, all that's set very much in the context of urban planning and urban governance. But there are 2 points to note about the way we construct our argument. First of all, we refute the idea that city visions are impossible because of their inherent city complexity and the fact that we're embedded within such visions. Michael Batty, for example, argues very much against the fact of more generic type visions vis-a-vis Ebenezer Howard and other people like Patrick Geddes, who kind of imagined in the past the shape and form of an ideal city. And what we argue for is not for predictions or generic visions so much as for co-produced and co-created participatory visions, which are truly deliberative and are based around foresight techniques. And so our conceptual framework, which is really defining what urban futures are, is to imagine what cities and urban areas will be like in the long term, beyond 20 years, how they'll operate, what kind of infrastructure and governance systems underpin them and coordinate them, and how they're best shaped and influenced by their primary stakeholders. And Mark will talk a bit later on in the presentation about the importance of bringing those stakeholders together. So very much at the heart of our thinking is the concept of city foresight, which is really the science of thinking about the future of cities and includes a range of different methods and tools to help build and develop a city vision. And this is taken from the book, this diagram here, which shows the way that these different ideas link together, linking a science of cities with city foresight, but also a particular focus on transitions theory, which I'll come to in a moment. I suppose setting the book in context, since we wrote it and it was published in 2021, but the paperback edition came out last year, the book is kind of positioned around this focus on deliberative democracy. So it's a counterpoint to books that make the argument that we shouldn't be thinking about green and sustainable cities simply because the chaos and diversity of a city is something that should be embraced, and that green thinking is often imposed top down without taking account of democratic principles. And Des Fitzgerald's recent book on the city of today is a dying thing is a really interesting read from that point of view. But that isn't what our book is about. It's arguing that these kind of visions for cities that do integrate green thinking are fine, provided you give people a chance to have their say, which is where the deliberative democracy element comes in. And of course, we've seen a huge growth, particularly of citizens' assemblies globally, focusing particularly on environment, strategic planning, and urban planning. And then the other counterpoint to our book is, in terms of its positioning, this idea of co-creating visions where we bring people together. So I guess you could place our book somewhere around the deliberative democracy, participatory democracy part of this diagram, where again, we're giving people a chance to have their say in their vision of the city. Theoretically, our book's influenced by, I guess, two major strands of thought. Firstly, the idea of transition pathways, where we're looking at perhaps a focus on transformation and transitioning rather than towards simply adaptive or resilient change. I suppose you can think of those as a continuum. So we're definitely thinking that this requires very often a regime change or a big shift in our thinking. And we talk in the book about two kinds of ontological approaches to thinking about systemic change. Firstly, socio-ecological systems methodologies, which encompass society and ecosystems, thinking there of authors like Ostrom, for example, but primarily from our point of view, the socio-technical transitions theory, bringing together society, technology, and complexity, particularly through the work of Lurbach. and others. And here we see in this slide the way that those two strands of thinking are similar in some respects, but different in others. We're thinking here very much of a focus on STT, where this is an idea of transition management, where we do recognize complexity, but we see this very much as a multi-level perspective and using techniques such as backcasting and thinking about how we plot that future. If we imagine we're in the future in 2050, for example, how do we get there? How do we find that yellow brick road, if you will, towards the Emerald City? And you are, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with transitions theory, building on the Dutch energy transition of people like Frank Giels. It can be somewhat difficult to apply the multi-level perspective in cities because, after all, they're complex. There are different sectors that we have to think about in terms of energy, transport, water, waste, and all the other sectors that interact in a city. And we may be bringing in new technologies, but we also have to handle the transition from existing technologies if we're thinking about transport from the automobile towards electric vehicles, for example. And we often within cities, of course, face this inertia or lock-in, the technological lock-in that there is for major infrastructure. But of course, this idea of thinking about the wider socio-technical landscape, the regime, as the kind of middle level, how industry, culture, policy, and science and technology all interact, and the breakthrough of niche innovations through new technologies. All of this gives us a sense of how we might kind of think about managing that transition, and perhaps even comparing transition management in a way with urban planning as a wider, broader subject. But we do need, whenever we're using this kind of methodology, to think about the importance of power relations, how people's power is impacted from the relationships that are set up within visions and the outcomes of those visions. Nevertheless, it's very important that we use foresight techniques, we believe, to create these kind of visions. And this brings us back to the science of thinking about the future of cities. We're drawing on a diverse set of methods to give decision makers very much comprehensive evidence about anticipated and possible future change. And I think our thinking was influenced very much by the UK government Office of Science, Future of Cities Foresight program, which ran a little less than 10 years ago, which used a range of techniques. Both Mark and I were closely aligned with that network, and we've continued to promote some of the ideas that program put forward. So it's really important to think about overcoming that disconnection between short-term planning horizons, which often operate over the electoral cycle, and longer-term environmental change, which operates from 20, 25 years and upwards through to 2050 and beyond. How can we construct a range of futures that might incorporate a more probable future, nesting within other scenarios or other futures which are plausible, but even less certain, perhaps, possible futures at the outer edge. And so, again, I think it's really important to think about how we construct those futures. This was quite an interesting view from a recent report from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which was looking at foresight techniques in territorial governance. But I thought it was quite a nice way of illustrating this relationship between foresight techniques and the way that participation can lead to deliberation, but then there's collective ownership from the parties involved. So the future, as the quote says here, is not predetermined, but it's actually constructed by the actions and decisions of individuals and societies. And it's the way in which those social, technological, environmental, economic, political, and cultural dynamics come together in any given territorial area, or whatever kind of spatial scale that is, that creates that collective vision and the actions and outcomes that that vision promotes. So there's a continuum from reflecting about the future, obviously, towards the actions that emerge from that foresight continuum. And we've seen in the past, we tackle these in the books, in the book that we're talking about right here, about the literature, about the art, and about the thinking that has gone into more kind of generic visions, you know, stretching back to Thomas More's Utopia, Plato's Republic, even earlier than that. But of course, Le Corbusier's City for a Million, Ebenezer Howard's work, and through film and art, etc. And I suppose a burning question is, why do we really need visions for cities? Well, we argue in the book they give cities and the people that live in them and govern them a sense of purpose, that they underpin our vitality and belief systems. They create a way of finding what sort of future do we really want. And of course, they're a way of overcoming disagreement because they promote discussion and debate. Citizens' assemblies are another way of bringing people together, which I was alluding to earlier. So anything that kind of creates a platform for democratic discussion and debate, in my view, has to be a good thing. And so we can then start to ascribe and mobilize resources around those desired futures. And we've seen lots of examples from around the world of city visions, from cities in the UK, such as my home city in Bristol, through to Copenhagen, through to the city of Vancouver. I was involved in the Reading 2050 vision. Mark will talk in a moment about Newcastle City Futures project, which looked all the way through to 2065. And a lot of these visions that have been produced, examples from Oxford here and Reading, as well as Montreal, the more recent vision, they kind of reimagine what the future might be. There are interesting visuals that are often used within these contexts and different techniques, again, that lead to those visuals that have been deployed to get there. And so in the book, we look at the emergence and the evolution of those city visions from the very early ones in the USA and Canada, examples from Atlanta and Vancouver and Portland, Phoenix, and so on. These were very much planning led, with some community-based elements within them, including in the UK, Bristol, Oxford and Edinburgh, and other parts of the world, Helsinki, Sustainable Sydney, and so on and so forth. More recently, the two visions that I mentioned earlier were part of that Government Office, the Science Future of Cities programme, Newcastle 2065 and Reading 2050, but we've also seen more recent examples in the UK, such as Edinburgh 2050 as well. So I'm going to pass over at this point to Mark. Mark, will you let me know when you want to move on from each slide?
Yeah, I certainly will, Tim, and thanks very much. And hello, everyone. I realise time is going on, so I'm going to fly through a series of slides. And these slides, I suppose, represent a slightly different focus of the talk compared to what Tim has covered so far. The book deals with strong conceptual and indeed historical elements. But the book also deals with practicalities and practical and normative issues as well. Tim mentioned that we are both involved as academics with a UK government project on the future of cities, which is a UK-wide initiative, looked at international examples as well. And prior to me rejoining UCL in 2020, I was professor of town planning at Newcastle University in the north of the UK for 8 years. And while I was there, I engaged with the Future of Cities project, but also led a pilot. And it really came about in about 2014, 2015, as a series of happy coincidences, I suppose. Both Tim and I were working on issues to do with spatial governance, on futures, from an academic point of view, but I've always been interested, like him, in practical issues and operationalizing some theoretical issues into workable ideas for practitioners. And my then president of the university said, why don't you do something about the city now that you're here? It sounds as though it was quite an easy task to do. He said, just go out and talk to people and listen to people and see what the agendas are. And you have to remember that the UK over the last 10 years or so is really undergoing a series of crises, consecutive crises about a whole host of things. One of which is the lack of funding for local government, municipal government, the short-term nature of planning, and the undermining of long-term thinking and strategic thinking for planning, and a lack of capacity on the part of professional planners to do things differently. And that was certainly the case in Newcastle, Newcastle and Gateshead, two local authorities in the north. And Newcastle City Council had lost 1/3 of its entire budget because so much of that budget comes from central government, and ideologically through austerity, it had cut that budget to most local governments. The planning department had been scrapped, and half the planning professionals had been removed. So it wasn't the easiest of ideas, perhaps, to go out and do something about the city and work with municipal government to perhaps test some of these ideas of city visioning and city foresight if the elements of the institutions were collapsing about us as we were trying things. But that was the context, and it was an important context actually, which enabled us to do something that perhaps might have been difficult elsewhere. We set up an initiative that we called Newcastle City Futures with municipal government, with the other university, Northumbria, and with other government agencies. And we wanted to see whether we could develop a conversation with actors in the city about what the prospects were for the future. Now, as I said, it was quite a bleak future, perhaps, in the immediate term, given everything that was going on. But we thought there was a lack of a citywide arena for people to talk about what was going on in the city and to have a sense of optimism of the future. So initially, it was, let's think about the future. Let's open up the conversation beyond the traditional sources of academics preaching to everyone and maybe municipal government and politicians talking about current problematic issues, and think if there was a way of doing things a little bit differently. If you could move on, please, Tim. And so rather than the academics putting on their big boots and telling everyone what the future might be, because that could be one aspect of city visioning and city foresight, what we decided to do in the spirit of deliberative democracy and co-production was open up the debate, perhaps with a little bit of reluctance initially from municipal government, who wondered why the university was doing this. I know the University of Toronto has a strong history of being a civic university. Newcastle University also is a civic university as well. It's interested in what research can be done to give something back to the city and region in which it's located. But initially, municipal government in Newcastle was a little bit skeptical of the university taking on this, especially academics, who perhaps are not renowned for being the most practical or sensible on times as well. And what we realized is rather than just do this and think arrogantly we could do things better, we decided just to create platforms of opportunities. And we needed to create new methods because those methods were not in place practically to enable those conversations to happen. So as we went along and started listening to different agencies and actors in the city about what their long-term agendas and ambitions were, so we realized that the current consultation mechanisms of municipal government, the current participatory mechanisms of the planning system were just not geared up to think about long-term futures. So as part of this, we had to devise our own methods, our own operational devices to create that. And we kept on saying it's long-term, it's long-term. In fact, the initiative was called 2065. It was 2050 in Reading. And the beauty of that was it meant that we could detach ourselves a little bit from those short-term financial, political problems that seem to be dominating the agenda. Get people thinking about the long-term future, keep that as they focus, and maybe then you'd start a conversation which is a bit more proactive and optimistic. As you can see by these images, we embarked on a whole series of methods for a complete 2-year period, where, if anything, a team of 4 of us just went round and listened to everyone in the city. We didn't preach, we listened, and we garnered opinions from everyone about what they thought of the city, what were the good things, what were the bad things, what could happen, but maybe city government wasn't listening to them about. We went into schools, we created new digital opportunities, we created creative methods to have a level playing field that people could talk more openly without using complex syntax that is, the hallmark perhaps of official forms of planning, legalese speak. So we created methods which were accessible, and that opened up the conversations. If you could move on, please, Tim. And part of that was we thought we'd just create these new forums and arenas, a whole toolkit of different proactive methods where people would talk about the city, and that would be an alternative to the fairly stoic methods that were being employed by city government at the time, and it would create a new conversation that maybe city government would be interested in. Something I realized very quickly is if you're going to create these opportunities and people buy into these opportunities, you better be ready to know what to do with the outcomes. So as well as creating the methods, if the methods work, then people will want to say, well, what are you going to do about these things? They're not just prepared to just talk anymore, they want action. And so we realized very quickly that we had to create other methods which were not only collaborative in nature and deliberative in nature, we had to create methods which enabled possible new policies on new projects, capital projects, digital projects to emerge. And we had to do that on a citywide basis, covering everything that was of interest to the city and people and businesses in the city. In other words, we couldn't just focus on existing policy silos. We couldn't take an economic development perspective alone, or a transport perspective, or an elderly people perspective. We had to go across, and government and universities, for that matter, are not usually structured in that sort of way. They don't encourage that fluidity across the different silos that you find yourselves in institutionally. So we had to confront people with not only the reality of this is where we are and this is how we might change in the future, but maybe start a conversation about, well, what's good about the city that we could start as the basis of creating something different and something new. Remember, this wasn't just the public that we were trying to engage with. We were trying to engage with businesses and government and members of the public, and indeed the university sectors as well. And most of my efforts at that time seemed to be trying to do joining up within the university, because we didn't have anything like the School of Cities at Newcastle. So I had to do the joining up inside as well as trying to corral people outside as well. And in that process, what I was doing was taking the initiative forward from an engagement and discussion of the long-term future into saying, actually, let's do something about it, let's build. Not me personally, and certainly not the university necessarily, but maybe I'd become a facilitator or networker for new networks to be realized, which ultimately would do it. So if you look at this, can't see it in any detail, but this illustration was the typical diagrams that we use with people in conversation to talk about the positive things about the city and region. That for every £1 invested in culture, you get a £5 return. That 8 million people use public transport and the rail system in the city every year. That there's a significant student population as well, that there'd be £1 billion spent on retail in the city centre. These were things that were seen to be lost in conversations while the politicians were talking about finance and talking about Brexit and talking about all the problems of funding local government in the future. And we just provided something as a counterbalance to those debates to say, actually, there's stuff going on here that's really interesting. And maybe they could form the platforms upon which you do something different in the future. If you could move on, please, Tim. And so what we decided to do was think about the opportunities of being in between. That's the beauty. If you don't focus on existing policy, but you try and operate within the parameters of existing policy, but you're not obsessed about policies, you're not obsessed about producing a plan, for example, it's just a series of constant dialogues and opportunities, then you can think about spaces in between. And so rather than talk about housing or jobs or transport, what we tried to do was come up with these themes using foresight techniques like Delphi methods and scenarios to look at the opportunities in the city which come from things joining up with other things. So if you want to be an age-friendly or family-friendly city, it's about addressing issues about housing and housing for the life course. It's about harnessing new technology for assisted living, for example. It's about sustainability, but it might be using digital technology and health concerns about that. It might be trying to use creative methods and talk about visualizations as a way of enacting culture and creative arts, which then can be used to generate other conversations about some of the more intractable issues to do perhaps with climate change or net zero. And science as well. You know, it was very telling perhaps in the UK that significant research budgets have gone into research on cities, but they've gone into STEM subjects. So why not use that investment and harness it, use that science and engineering and digital technology and bring it back to the problems of the city as well? And that's exactly what started to work out as a series of conversations which had moved from engagement to research. And now in about 2016, 2017, people started to focus on doing things and doing projects. So we can move on, please, Tim. And we decided to use another working method to do this, by which there was no difference between government and members of the public and businesses. They were all in this together because we had enabled that conversation to go seamlessly together rather than address everyone differently and have different participatory sessions. We brought everyone in so that everyone could talk with each other constantly, and we adopted this quadruple helix method of open innovation, where we create new methods where they work together. And so if people were interested in doing something about housing for the life course or about children's opportunities of developing skill sets, for example, then it wouldn't just be that sector or one group of people. We would open this up to all the sectors and all agencies who were interested, and they'd work on the projects together. If you could move on, please, Tim. And these were the initial agencies that we brought together to try and do that. And it was government, it was businesses, it was communities, and it was the universities as well. These were the 20 founding partners of NCF in 2016, 2017. But by the time that NCF had been wound up in 2019, we had 200 partners. across all the sectors. And they came, we didn't invite anyone to ask anyone to be involved. They volunteered to come forward and be involved. And what that meant was some of the projects could be realized not just by municipal government, but by other agencies as well. But they would all be co-owned and co-created, and they would do something about it. If you could move on, please, Tim. And we created these, what were called Lego mashups, where you might have a series of round tables where you'd have a school teacher sat next to a chief executive of a major industry in the city, who was sat next to an academic, who was sat next to someone who was from a mental health charity. And the idea was we would ask them to address one problem and one opportunity of the city as one, and see if they could come up with projects which then could be realized in practice. We had to say very openly, we had no money ourselves to do this, but we would strive to find ways of doing it. And we thought we'd be lucky to find any single project that came out from this Lego mashup experience. We ran them over 18 months, 40 different actors at each workshop. We ran about 6 or 7 of them. And in the event, by 2017, 75 projects had been created, all co-created, all co-owned, and all using long-term futures foresight methods to do something about it. Now, I haven't got time to go into this now, but just to say that during this time, we helped and facilitated the delivery of 45 of those projects. 150 million was levered in for the projects. Lots of different projects were enacted which affected the well-being of the city and the residents within it. And if you like, my job was just to enable this to do it, and then stand back and allow those agencies to work on the projects together. Could move on, please, Tim. And so I'll come on to some summary issues. For me, this is about making it workability, the workability of urban futures as both a conceptual device, but also a method for practice to use and pick up as well. The idea that only one group of people or one group of professionals can work on some of these problems of cities and the complexity of them is no longer a valid, legitimate issue or excuse to use. You need new forms of collaboration, and you need co-creativity, and you need models to enable that to happen, but you need rules to be set in almost a form of regulation, soft regulation, to ensure that the benefits are shared across different agencies as well. So government can work with businesses, can work with members of the public and with academics on single projects where the returns and the benefits for them are multiple in nature and they benefit from them. But that has to be nurtured, and it has to be seamlessly delivered as far as possible as well. If you can move on, please, Tim. And that means that even though I'm a planner, I have to recognize that perhaps the solution is not always planning, and it's not always devising a single plan or master plan for the city. Some of these issues that we realize through the conceptual work and the methodological work could be addressing really complex problems that had to be addressed simultaneously rather than through policy silos or through waiting for a plan to be adopted, which takes years and years, or waiting for a bag of money to appear from an investor. You can do so much in the interim, which moves away from predictive trend-based plans. But we're still talking about spatial methods. We're still talking about an accountable device. We're still talking about enhancing democracy in one shape or form using a multiplicity of devices and methods to do it. So methods such as visioning, collaboration, intelligence as a continual cycle of activities where you work with the agencies in the city to enhance and boost your city can make a difference to the city rather than just wait for the planning system to kick in and do that. If you can move on, please, Tim. And so this is our view about moving, a subtle move, if you like, moving from planning to urban futures. And that's about creating a practical and formal framework about how they might be in the future. Essentially, it's not a blueprint, it's a roadmap. People want to have a sense of idea about where the city is going, what their role might be in it, what positive aspects could be developed that they could be involved with or shape themselves. So we devised this as a series of interrelated mechanisms, developing city visions based on participatory processes using a range of city foresight methods to achieve place-based innovation. All of that could support planning. It could support municipal government. It could support growth. It could support issues of climate change and indeed the university's civic role in the city as well. These are not challenges to those. They're just creating new pathways to enable something to be unlocked in the short term. Now, Tim, do I hand back to you now for the final few slides?
If that's okay, Mark. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
that's fine.
yeah, Karen, I'm assuming we've got a few more minutes just to tidy things up.
Yeah, if you could just, yeah, we do have some questions, so just if you could wrap up in the next minute, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, that's no problem. So I think what we've been saying today, what both Mark and I have been saying in terms of what we think are the most important things to reflect upon are that often visions kind of reflect power relations. To take an example of this, in the Reading 2050 vision, it was very much a business-led, academic-led vision. And what we would argue is that it's really important for citizens to play an important role in the creation of those visions, hence the idea of citizen engagement, but something more than that, that it is a deliberative process that brings people on board. How does that vision complement or even compete with existing plans and strategies? That's also very important. Clearly, the role of the city authority as a leader or as a co-leader is vital to bear in mind. Mark's touched on the idea of independent and trusted universities as playing a really important role. Since we wrote the book, there's been a lot of scholarly work around digitization and artificial intelligence and how that might almost create an institutional void within the city because of the issue of self-governing technology. So how do we take account of that changing landscape if we're constructing a digital twin? How do we make sure that people that live in that city have a say in a democratic way in the processes and the outcomes of that project? And of course, the vision is very much a continuing process. It's not the end of the journey. There needs to be a continual refreshment. Just as a throwaway slide here, you know, to look at the impact of AI, I produced these two rather fun graphics of what Oxford and Reading would look like in 2050. You know, it's sort of biomes and the Eden Project in Oxford and Blade Runner in Reading. But it just goes to show what you can do with art generation in an AI context. Some further reading for those of you that are interested. I think we both strongly recommend Michael Batty's book on inventing future cities, and also Nick Dunn and Paul Kewerton's book, who were both involved in the Future Cities project, Future Cities Visual Guide, and then more recently, Ian Goldin and Tom Lee Devlin's Age of the City book. And we've also both of us been involved in a regional studies association on a special issue on city region foresight and visioning. Finally, but last but no means least, those of you that are interested in buying the book can take an advantage discount up until the end of this month. So thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to jump right into questions. I have a pile, but I actually see that there are 3 in the chat. And so let's start with those in the chat as a courtesy to our guests. So Bharat Punjabi says, how did you get so many diverse actors in the group?
Do you mean for the Newcastle experience?
Yes, I think that's when he wrote that comment. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of work. I was bought out from the university. I should have said that. I was seconded out of the university to effectively be the city's person for the university on an operational sense, not a management sense, on a full-time basis. So I spent 2 years just going around and having meetings with everyone in the city. You have to remember that I was new in the city myself. That worked to some advantage because I could play the naive card a little bit to curry favor. But I went round and I was having something like 20 meetings a week for 2 years, and just developing the trust. Needless to say, I was still viewed as the university, and therefore there was mistrust about the university in the city, given the the building program that higher education normally does in the city as well. So I had to say, I'm not here for that. I'm not here for me. I'm not here for the university. I'm here because I'm interested in you, and I'm interested in what you think of the city. So it was developing trust as much as possible for 2 years, and that went across all the sectors. We had, if you like, it was, a stage entertainer have spinning plates, and the more plates you spin, the more hectic it becomes on stage, and you're worried about the plates falling over. Well, the more successful we were becoming, the more plates we had to deal with, because people wanted us to listen to them and to engage with them and introduce them to others. We adopted a range of methods. We had exhibitions, we had film evenings, we had discussions. We used, I think, 15 different methods altogether of a participatory nature in those 2 years. And 155,000 people had got involved with the initiative by the end of the 5-year period. But of course, it was exhausting. That's where the grey hair came. And also it meant that there was an expectation to do more. And that's when I had to smooth the path, I suppose, back into the city government, back into the university and with others, to see whether and what they wanted to pick up and run with in the short term, while we use social media and traditional press to keep on engaging people, rather than just leave it and say, we'll come back to you in 5 years' time. So the engagement was near constant because that's what they expected.
Great. Let me just ask you quickly two of the remaining questions combined. There's a question from Dr. Tamalti about how in Canada and the US, there's strong resident interest in detached homes and maintaining neighborhood character, but the planners are emphasizing infill opportunities, diversity, compact urban landscapes, et cetera. Have you noticed this discrepancy in your own work, and how do you explain it? And in a related one, Adriana Docena asks if you work in alignment with sustainability climate plans.
Could I,
Do you want to do the housing one?
Yeah, could I maybe go for the second one, which is around sustainable city and climate plans? I'm involved with colleagues at Oxford who've done a lot of work around citizens' assemblies and citizens' groups. There is a growing consensus that climate assemblies can play an important role in helping broker that kind of longer term thinking and bring consensus about. I think as far as the kind of 15-minute city argument is concerned, Carlos Marino has received a lot of flack for some of the thoughts and ideas that he's promoted. But his work has primarily focused and influenced Mayor Hidalgo's mayorship in Paris, and she was elected on that ticket to modify and promote 15-minute cities. So there's a good example of, democratic consensus around that introduction of that plan. Whereas in Oxford, the 15-minute city label has kind of been banished because it's not considered to be a helpful label, simply because of the conspiracy theories that operate. So in terms of the sustainable city arguments, there's greater traction being gained in France than in many parts of the UK. Maybe we can take some lessons from what happens over there in the way that we approach things.
Mhm, mhm.
I'm not sure that I've kind of answered specifically the question, but I've kind of given you a thought process of how the work that I've been involved in plays out in terms of climate assemblies and citizens assemblies
Thank
and
you.
green thinking.
That's great. And Mark, we're actually at time, but if you had a last word, we'll let you get it in.
Yeah, I'll be very quickly on the housing side. The usual debate in the UK is about accessing any form of housing at all to buy, because housing is so expensive and unaffordable to most groups. You have to be on a massive salary, and I don't just mean in London. I mean, across a significant part of the country. But in Newcastle, it's still accessible. So the ratio between house prices and wages, for example, is still very accessible for most people. So a housing crisis in the Northeast isn't quite the same as the housing crisis that you find in London and the Southeast, which dominates politicians' interest. The core plan, the local plan for Newcastle, had been adopted in 2014, and it had deregulated part of the Greenbelt, which you would never, ever get in the southeast of England. That's going to be a major issue, and it'll blow up very quickly. But it had happened very easily in the Northeast because people wanted homes, and that was the debate, and that was allowed politically. There was an agenda and part of our initiative for housing, but it was housing for distinct groups. So one of the projects that came about was housing for the life course, where people said, right, we want dementia-friendly housing, we want assisted living housing in an urban location rather than suburban location. Those are the things that are missing, are bespoke to the needs of the citizens, and therefore can we do a project? And a financier got involved, a housing developer got involved, city government got involved, and eventually that project in 2 years went from an idea into a planning permission granted for 70 units on a city centre site for that. And we created a governance vehicle to go with it to ensure the housing can be sold off on the open market. So where there was an interest in housing, it was for bespoke needs as opposed to general housing. And we had to say quite openly where the red lines were. First of all, we were not the elected body. We were not Democrats in the sense that we had the power to be able to do this. So we had to say very early on in all our discussions, look, we are just trying to unlock opportunities, but ultimately it's for the official agencies to act if they want to. And also, some of these debates have been addressed through the traditional consultation mechanisms, like Greenbelt policy through the local plan. We are not replacing representative democracy. We're not replacing the consultation mechanisms or the formal plan system. There are other opportunities that you need to embark on to do that for those issues. We are addressing something additional to that. And that's people recognize that difference very easily, and then adjusted their agendas accordingly.
Great. Thank you guys so much. This has been a great talk, and you'll see there's more questions in the chat. So obviously we could have gone on for another 30 minutes, but we must end. So thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you all back at the next School Cities talk. And hopefully next time in person in Canada, Mark and Tim. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Karen.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.